And we are live with Zakiya Sankara Jabar, former National Field Director with Dignity in the Schools, co-founder of the Racial Justice Network that began in Ohio and is now national and has affiliates and friends and family across the country who are doing justice work. And currently, most important to me, Zakiya is also the National Director of Activism and Outreach for Brightbeam, the organization that I work for and the team that I work for. Zakiya, thank you for coming on the show this morning. I appreciate it.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
I appreciate it. So I called this show the Sons of Black Folk is what I named this show. And the reason I named it that is because I think your activism has been a leadership that we don't have enough of, which is looking specifically at the school system's treatment of Black boys and Black children writ large. But let's just say Black boys specifically have an issue within public schools for sure, whether they be charter, district, magnet, open, whatever. I've said that I don't believe that the system loves Black children. And people have been angry with me when I say that. That's a broad brush, Chris, they say. You're making too much of things or whatnot. Help me out here, Zakiya, like your experience with your son in the systems that you have been in. What have you learned and what has stuck with you as an activist that has kept you fighting?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I would say I would actually agree with your assessment, right? The experience I had with my son actually politicized me. As a Black woman in this country, clearly I know that race, or I did know like race was an issue, but I did not realize, how endemic, if you will, it is in all institutions, in all, areas of, people activity. And so when my son was 3 years old is when I, met this system of education in preschool that wanted to identify him through a deficit lens and wanted to identify him, as a problem child. And I would say for me, that's when what's the cliche, mama bear, mama lion, whatever. That's when it came out. I was like, oh no, we're not going to have this. And I just intuitively just questioned everything that they were saying, because number one, it was new. I had never heard anybody describe my child the way that the educators at this particular preschool and also the principal of that preschool did. And I just questioned what was happening. And then I literally did a scan of the school, and it was predominantly white. It was on the campus of the university I was attending at the time in suburban Dayton. Dayton also has one of the largest Air Force bases in the country. And so it was really close to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So most of the clientele was able to afford the childcare and the preschool that they offered. I happened to be one of the parents who needed assistance. So I was receiving a government subsidy at the time because I was working part-time and also a full-time college student. And I qualified for a program called Title 20. And I remember at that time, the receptionist, everybody, treated me pretty disrespectfully, and how she just engaged with me. And this is where the class issue or socioeconomic status kind of comes in for many Black women, working class Black women, is that they make you feel just terrible about yourself and your current situation. Never mind the fact that I was actually in college full time. Clearly, I'm trying to bootstrap my way out of poverty. I'm working part time and all of that. So that experience politicized me, Chris, and it made me dive deeper in reading. A lot of people don't know this. I was actually in school to be a BSN nurse at the time. And I completely changed my major when I went to the library, because I was looking for answers. Why is my son, being treated this way? Why am I being treated this way? Right. And I got into JSTOR and I just did a search and I put Black boys in education. And you could just imagine the articles, the books, recommendations that came up. And the very first book that I read probably in a couple of days, if not a day or two, was by Dr. Joanza Kunjufu, called Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And
Yeah.
that book it literally changed the trajectory of my life and where I am today. Seriously.
Yeah, that book is powerful, and
Yeah,
people listening or watching this should definitely, especially if you're a Black parent, read that book and look at that book.
absolutely.
What do you think
He
is the
taught me how to organize. He literally taught me how to organize. He gives practical advice to parents in that book. And I remember he said, never go to a meeting alone. All up until then, I was going to those meetings by myself. He said, always take notes. He said, their strategy is they're going to surround you. He said, they're going to surround you by all of these people. And it's an intimidation factor to get you to agree to what they're saying about your child. So for me, really quickly, I'll share that one of the things that they did was clearly they pathologized him, but they also said things to me that they thought would trigger a working class parent, right? Like, oh, they say, oh, if he has a disability, right? So here's the overrepresentation of Black boys in special education, right? Like, here's the trigger. This is what happened to me. You should have him evaluated by a psychologist. A 3-year-old. I said, wow. Are you saying he's crazy? I was literally asking him. I said, he's 3. He's just a baby. I remember I had tears in my eyes. And this is the kind of violence. That's violence to me. The violence that Black women, Black parents face a lot of times with their children while they're struggling, trying to work, and while they're, for me, attending higher education. And I have to share this with your team. I was actually forced to drop out of college at that time because I ended up taking him out of that environment because I did not trust the educators in that building anymore. And when my son came to me and said, Mommy, I don't think my teachers like me, that broke my heart. And I said, I'm taking him out of here. And I had to drop my classes. Yeah.
And so that, that becomes the type of story that you probably can hear over and over again, right? Like protecting your child in school becomes a full-time job in some cases.
It did. I literally started an organization. It's actually called Racial Justice Now. Yeah. I literally started an organization and started organizing other Black parents.
Wow. And you were hearing the same types of stories. You learned quickly you weren't alone.
Thankfully, because I was feeling so alone. And I found out that because of the shame, because it's almost like your kid getting arrested. Oh, your kid got suspended too. So it's shame because we live in a culture that it's the parents' fault. He must have horrible parents. And I wasn't a horrible mom, right? I was a mom like any other mom who wanted the best for their child. The fact that I bent over backwards and went through the violence of having to go down to an office of a public assistance office to fill out an application and join the waiting list, like that, to me, they didn't see that as I'm trying to do the best for my child while also doing the best for myself. That didn't even enter their imagination, the way that they treated me and the way that they talked to me and the way that they treated my son. I actually ended up filing a civil rights complaint against that school. I went all the way. I have to share this too, because one of the experts that I used in my narrative to my complaint, the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, was Dr. William Gilliam from Yale Child Studies Center. And he had just did a report that showed the astronomical number of Black boys in preschools getting kicked out of private preschools, because most preschooling in this country is private. So that was a private preschool. And I used that. I actually talked to him on the phone. I just did a search. And he answered the phone. I was shocked because I called Yale and I said, hey, I'm having this situation with my son and I just read your report. Can you, share a little bit more about why did you want to do this report? And he said he had heard from parents like me in the past and decided to study it.
Wow.
Exactly.
So this is at 3 years old.
Yes.
What happens, after 3? What happens in kindergarten, first grade, and third grade? Does it get increasingly more difficult, or do you find more help?
So I think I'm a privileged parent now because I have become an organizer. I'm now a national, expert, if you will, in education justice. And so I have had supports, but I have continued to have problems with my son in school. I'll share that once I took him out of that preschool, I ended up, he went to kindergarten. I actually started him off in another school in Dayton. It was a charter school. I think I shared this story with you. And I didn't like the way they again treated parents. It was this idea that no, you just drop your kids off, we're the experts, and you have to make an appointment to visit. And I was like, excuse me? Like, I'm like, I don't know what kind of parents y'all used to, but that's not how I operate. But the other thing is, he had a first year teacher out of the University of Dayton. And she actually went to their University of Dayton has an urban like education program, and they can teach in inner city schools and get their loans forgiven and all of that. And so she was a young white woman. And I remember I was giving them a hard time about wanting to do an observation. Keep in mind my experience in preschool. So I'm a helicopter mom at this point. I'm wanting to do an observation. I want to make sure he's okay. And I'm already triggered because here you are, this young white woman. This is my experience with young white women in schools has not been good. And I remember I overheard her saying to another paraprofessional or another teacher, "Oh, I got her." That's what, if she was talking about me. I said, "Oh my God." I said, "Y'all gonna have to call the police in a minute because me and you don't have me. What are you talking about? This is my child." Yeah. And so again, and she was always reporting issues. There was always something wrong with him. And I, as a parent, sometimes when you hear that over and over again, you start to think something, is there something wrong with him? And then I actually called Dr. Kunjufu. I called him. I emailed him, and then he said, "Call me." He said, "Do you all have single gender schools in your city?" I said, "We do." I said, "In the public school system, we do. In Dayton, we did. We had an all boys academy and we had an all girls academy." He said, "Try that." And that is where I ended up. I took him out of that charter school and I put him back in the public school, and he went to the all boys school. It was called Dayton Boys Academy, and he had a black male educator. And I get emotional sometimes when I think about this because I still had that helicopter thing. And I remember I took him over there and I'm like, I just hope all this works out. I remember Mr. Burris. I love him to this day. He was an excellent educator. I remember how he welcomed me. He welcomed Amir. He was excited. I remember just how loud his classroom was. Like he was playing that hip hop ABC. It's by Nikki Giovanni. There's a hip hop book that she has out that does the ABCs in hip hop music. And they were in there learning their ABCs and jumping up and down, and like they weren't he didn't expect them to sit down the whole time. Like it was just a completely different environment. The kids were engaged. And I remember he was there for a couple of weeks, and I was like, well, damn, I haven't gotten an email. Nobody's called. Let me go up to the school and see what's going on. This is not normal.
You thought it was suspicious.
I was like, let me go. And he said, I will never forget this. He said, "Amir?" He said, "Oh, he's one of my best students." And I started to cry. Yep.
Because that was validation of what you secretly knew. And finally, somebody was saying it.
Exactly. He didn't see him through a lens of a problem. He was black, he's a male, and he was a boy, right? Like, so he could see themselves in him, and they could see themselves in them. That research is powerful. That's why when people say the research of, black boys in particular doing better with black male educators, I live that.
And you watched yesterday's show, and so in yesterday's program, discipline came up as one of the issues that we talked about, and it was with Max Eden. And Max talked yesterday about the research that basically says that the disproportionate discipline of Black children is not based upon institutional bias or the bias of the teachers. It has other factors. And I think the other factors that he was speaking of are outside of the classroom, dealing with the home, the family, the community, and the socioeconomic status that they have. I tried to introduce in that conversation, but what about the research that literally does tell us that there is bias in the teaching pool? And you can see it in the difference between the same child's interaction with a Black teacher and a white teacher. They have different outcomes.
Same child,
different statistical outcomes if you put them in a classroom with a Black teacher versus a white teacher. And that opens up a lot of questions.
Gender matters too, even in the teachers.
Right. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, if you think of white female teachers with a black boy, growing boy, that is a power and cultural dynamic that has so much history and other things going on in that moment that it would be too simplistic to ignore
That's
that,
right.
that there's something happening there, right? Like this isn't just
Right.
a teacher and a child, right? There's more going on to that in the power dynamic. But we can't even get people to admit that the research really does tell us things like these teachers actually look at black boys and adultify them because they see them as older than they actually are,
Yes.
right? Like if you were to ask them the age, make them guess the ages of black boys versus ask them to guess the ages of white boys, they would be very spot on with white boys. They would generally think that black boys are older than they are.
That
Um,
actually happens with my son now, but he is pretty tall. He's taller than me. He's 12. He's in seventh grade now. Very bright student. Your listeners should know that he's in advanced classes. So the entire time that people were looking at him through this lens of a deficit, he always had leadership skills and have always been really, really highly intelligent. And there's also some research to show too that some black boys in particular are misidentified and put in other special education classes when they actually qualify for gifted and talented. But people never test them for that. You're disruptive because that's just who you are. You're a deficit, you're black, but instead of you're disrupted because you're bored as hell in this classroom, like I'm bored. This is not engaging.
well, and I worry about, like, in this case, you were active and you were there and you saw what was going on. So he eventually ends up in a place that sees his talents, his merit,
Yes.
sees how to
Yes.
put them forward. So, so he suddenly becomes a talented kid, which in actuality, that could have went very different. That could have
If
went
I
very
didn't
different.
advocate, if I
Yeah.
had to succumb to the white teachers at the preschool telling me, oh, you can get a check if he has a disability, and they have to make sure, and your school district where you live have to provide services according to federal law. Like they had the whole scheme set up. That's how they were pushing black kids out of their school.
Nobody talks about that very much. Like the
Yeah.
fact that they dangle money in front
They
of you.
dangled money in my face, and that actually made me even more angry. Even I would set my child's life trajectory for a small government check. Are they serious? I mean, the fact that they thought that would be enticing to me,
Mhm.
I was so angry. I had to do all kinds of things to constrain myself because I felt so disrespected that
I
they
want to
think
unpack
that I would want that.
for people watching who don't know what we're talking about right now. I just want to unpack that a little bit in case you don't know anything
Sure.
about this. But for people listening or watching who don't know what we're talking about, there are times where the school will dangle financial incentives for labeling your child as either disabled in some way, shape, or form, or needing some sort of a service that requires Social Security or other things that
Yep.
will literally come with a government check if you just go ahead and succumb to it.
Yep.
So if you go ahead and put this label on your child, even though that child is going to suffer the consequences of
Oh
being
yeah.
disabled from that day forward, you're going to get some economic gain out of it in the short term from doing it, which is almost like making people accept plea deals, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like a different version it's the educational version of a plea deal
It
that is,
really is.
you know. Um,
It's education malpractice, and I don't know how people who do that sleep at night. Seriously,
mhm, mhm.
because if I didn't have the wherewithal to just, I mean, I questioned it, and what I learned in my organizing is that so many of our parents don't question it because they give over this because they feel like, well, they're professionals, right? I'm not a professional. I don't have a college degree. I'm not smart, but you are an expert on your child. You birthed that child. You've raised them until this. These people just met your child. Don't give, and so that was one of the things that I had to do in my community to organize parents to question everything. That's so simple. Just question it. And then,
Mhm.
a lot of times parents run into barriers. The other thing I'll say is like the way that the testing and achieving and all these kinds of things go. Of course, Dayton Public Schools is a city school system in the state of Ohio, and of course, it's always ranked low. And so I had to get over that even psychologically to put him into the all boys school because according to state documents, it's a horrible school. But from my experience, Chris, it was not. It was the best situation for my son. He didn't have to deal with psychological violence, and he didn't have to hear negative messages about himself. Even when you walked into the school, aesthetically, it was beautiful. There were pictures of African American leaders throughout history from the city of Dayton, so he could look up and say, oh, I could be mayor one day, because the first mayor was James H. McGee, right? He could look up and say, oh, there's an African American woman who was mayor, Ryan McLean. So those kind of things, and that's what Kunjufu talks about, and a lot of African-centered scholars talk about, those things are just as important for children to know that I can do it, right? So for me, obviously, I supplemented his education at home, which is what I encourage parents who have their children in inner city school districts that are ranked low. But we're in Montgomery County, Maryland now. And Amir scores just as high coming from Dayton City schools. When he got to Montgomery County, Maryland, the teachers here were, because they're not used to Black boys being smart, right? They're not, especially if they're disruptive, because he's still disruptive. He's a kinesthetic learner. That's the other thing. You know, I know there's some tension around learning styles, but I think that he definitely has one. And that was one of the things that Kunjufu also talks about. He has an entire book where he talks about, learning styles. And I remember when we first got here to MCPS, for folks who watching, it's considered one of the best school districts in the country. And, he tested, and the principal, who was a Black woman, was like, he's smart, but she wasn't saying it like she couldn't believe it. She was saying it like, no, we're going to work with this boy, right? I'm going to make sure that my teachers work with him. And so that's why one of the things that I try to encourage parents to do too, is because a lot of parents will take their kids out of a city of Dayton school where there are more Black teachers. They're not as many as there are in other places, but there are more Black teachers than there are in the suburbs that surround Dayton. And they'll put them in private school, they'll put them in suburban schools. And while they may have access to better curriculum or books or whatever, they're completely immersed in psychic violence every single day. And I have friends who still live in Dayton who send their kids to schools like Northmont or Oakwood or these other suburban areas. And they'll call me and say, can you believe this happened? Like some overt racist stuff. Like, it's nuts. It's happening in 2020.
I mean, there's so much in what you just said, if you unpack it, that is counterintuitive to much of the debate we have in education. Number one, the ability to choose a school, whether it looks good to others or not, is a very powerful thing. Like, I should be able to choose. Let me choose. You don't have to like the school, right? The other thing is this thing around single-sex schools. It gets you in trouble sometimes. They tried to open a boys' school to help Black boys in D.C., and they had a council member, very progressive council member, who was
a white woman. I already know who you're talking about. She really went after Mayor Bowser. She
went after him for that, and basically said, this is discrimination. This is it's, and that's the type of weird, wacky debates we have to get into, because this is a form of schooling that has been shown to be important for some, not all, Black boys. But you have a very progressive person sitting in a powerful position who is just like, no, this is discriminatory against girls, right? So your story, as you're telling it, it has implications for what we think about choice, like what a parent's right should be to choose, the way that we judge schools. Like, the way I might judge it differently, than it might not be good for you.
Right.
It might look terrible on paper, but it might be good for me. This thing around single sex, this thing around understanding something like psychic violence when you send your kids out to the suburbs, right? Because the idea is supposed to be that, we can't learn until we get in those environments, right?
That's the idea. There's so many middle-class Black people, as soon as they get some money, they move out of Dayton. Yeah.
And they go out there and it may have some benefits, but it isn't the dream that they thought it was, right? And you're having to make different choices. Tamika says, we as parents have to continue to engage and empower other parents to be relentless advocates for their children. What have you learned about helping other parents see the way to defend their children?
That was a very interesting experience. Many parents, come because they want help. They'll come to like our meetings. I would get calls from parents. Some parents would just want to engage more transactionally, like because they had other things going on, right? Like there was, you know, the hierarchy of needs, right? Like, okay, I'm going to lose my job, so I really need help right now. You know, I have to make sure he doesn't get expelled. So I was in position to make sure that I was able to help parents to do that, right? Or there were other parents who wanted to stay on long term and say, you know, this isn't right what's happening to my son, and I want to continue to be a part of the organization, to be a part of the change. So those parents became like what we would call our core leaders. So they would attend meetings with us in Columbus, which is the state capital for Ohio, where we were advocating for state law changes. We did advocate for a change in state law that we ended up getting called House Bill 318 in Ohio. And that law was passed to ban the pre-K through third grade suspensions in the state of Ohio for the vast majority of things. So we know that that will, you know, hopefully increase better outcomes academically for children in preschool through third grade, because they're not being suspended and expelled as much. And hopefully that would allow them more time to be in school to actually learn. Ohio is also one of the states, along with Michigan and Florida, that passed the third grade reading law that requires students to be able to read on grade level by third grade. If they're not able to read on grade level by third grade, the law in Ohio punishes the student and not the educators.
Ooh, how do they punish the student?
That student is held back in for reading. The students held. They made a couple of changes to that law since then, because what was happening was that in Ohio, the vast majority of kids, even kids out in the rural parts of the state, were being held back. So, of course, you know, you have people from the rural community joining with people from the urban cities and pushing for changes. So, since then, the metrics have been changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are you seeing that as something that people should advocate in other places? Is this something that's Ohio specific, or should be?
No. Actually, Senator Lehner, who was a Dayton area representative, she represented me when I lived in the city, and she's the one who we worked with on our bill. And we got her attention because she was the one who actually championed the third grade reading law. She's a Republican, and she was also the Senate education chairwoman. Republicans run the state of Ohio, and I have to share this story because our state representative, who was an African American at the time, was a Democrat. We went to him because we thought this would be something that he would be interested in and interested in helping us, and we wanted him to introduce a bill to stop this. Interestingly enough, he gets, he's friends with the teachers union, so he didn't touch it. It was only we only got movement when we went to the state education chairwoman who was a Republican, and the Republicans are the ones that passed and signed that bill into law in Ohio, which I share all the time, and I think that's very interesting, especially since it was led by Black folks.
Why wasn't the union though on board?
Really, Chris?
I mean, seriously, like
they were our biggest opponents in Dayton. But they eventually got on board. So, the Ohio Education Association, because I think they were getting pressure from nationals. And plus, this was sweeping the country. Keep in mind, the school to prison pipeline work has been happening for years in places like New York and in California, like on the coast. But then it started moving in, like places in Mississippi, Georgia, Ohio. Like they were losing other places. And so it forced the national unions to be more empathetic. They start changing some of their own policies around how they view this, because keep in mind, a lot of the unions in their contracts, like they were forcing these kind of like, no tolerance, zero tolerance. They wanted that kind of language. And so now we moved away from that, and everything has been about restorative justice. In fact, the NEA has partnered with community groups and with their local unions in some places, Denver being one of them, where they have one of the best collaborations, I would say, with a community group, the local teachers union, and then the school district, to bring down suspensions and expulsions, and to try to work together and do some training for teachers to get it to be more relational instead of just seeing problems and kicking kids out of school all the time. So that was not the case for us. So in Ohio, I would say is still very backwards in that regard. but we pushed and we pushed hard. And we eventually brought on bigger nonprofits like the Ohio, Children's Defense Fund. A lot of people didn't want to touch this. It was us. It was the people who were being directly impacted. It was Black parents, Black women in particular, who forced the issue. And we were the ones who got the ear of Senator Lanner. And so when she started holding these interested party meetings, people were shocked that she was even interested in the idea. But she did her job. We were the way that, I guess gerrymandered districts are a thing in a lot of places. Ohio was one of them. And so she happened to represent large portions of Dayton, and we were her constituents, and she listened.
Mm. I mean, I hear so much in that too. Like, sometimes your friends aren't your friends. Sometimes your enemies aren't your enemies.
That's so true.
The thing with anybody watching this or listening to this, what I would say to you, having run several campaigns locally, is all the magic is local. If you haven't interacted with your school board, your local elected officials, and on something very specific to this conversation, having read the teacher's contract from front to back and understand what is actually in it, because oftentimes your ignorance about what's in that contract is your problem, right?
Yes.
And I know here locally in the Twin Cities, the last time teachers were negotiating, and I think it was Minneapolis, may have been St. Paul. It was Minneapolis. They were actually trying to negotiate a clause that would prevent the district from taking mid-year transfer students from the suburbs if they had discipline records.
Wow.
Right. So you would not be able to transfer into a public school district if you had any type of discipline record from the suburbs. And they were trying to put that in the contract, right? The teacher's contract.
Mm-hmm.
When we told that to people, if we hadn't told them, they would have never believed it. If we had never showed that to them, they would have never known or believed that that's what, because at the same time, those same unions were having a lot of conversations about equity.
Yeah.
They talked a good game about equity.
They'll talk a good game. Equity. Yeah.
And when it came down to it, it wasn't really what they were fighting for.
No.
What have you seen in this? And I know you probably have seen a lot, but what have you seen that is special about special education in this regard with Black parents? Anything with Black parents who have to fight for their rights to get a 504 or a IEP or just to be heard? Has that come up for you a lot?
Yeah, so it's come up on a couple of different spectrums, right? So when I was in Ohio, we had a legal advocacy partner. Legal Aid of Western Ohio was one of our partners, and so there's a strong federal law around IDEA and 504. There were two things that came up though for us. There were parents who children should not, have been identified or labeled in the first place. And they had like a shoddy kind of like plan that actually didn't even meet the needs of the child. And so they would have to get some legal help. Parents had plans that they were never even involved in, which obviously violates the law. Parents are supposed to be very involved, and they're supposed to really have a lot of say when it comes to the plan. And then there were parents who were trying to get their kids reevaluated to even get them off because they had been mislabeled, right? They didn't need to be on it. It was a way for the school and the educator to simply get the child out of the regular class environment and literally have them in another environment. It's some of the things that I've seen has just been very egregious with how some school systems and educators take advantage of parent ignorance and their rights of their children and make things better for themselves, if you will, within a particular classroom environment. And so that has been one of the things that we've worked with parents. So both parents whose children need to be supported and need to have their child on a 504 plan or need to have their child, on an IEP. And then also parents who are fighting to get them off because they never needed it to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very strange thing. Yeah.
There's a convenient label to get you out of the classroom or to make it so you're not mainstreamed or
right.
There's, so anyways, a couple of tough questions. Here you go. Tough questions, Zakiya.
Yes.
This is the tough question portion. You have classrooms. There's a battle about whether or not the best way to maintain classrooms is to get the kids out who cause the most disruption and trouble so that the rest of the kids can learn, or you have more therapeutic ways of handling problems and issues when they come about. And you've said restorative justice multiple times. You know, Marika Pfefferkorn here in Minnesota, who actually ran a Dignity in Schools campaign here around discipline. And her and I used to have lots of conversations about this. And I used to say, you know, Marika, restorative justice to me feels like a bunch of people sitting in a circle, passing around some little totem of some sort, talking about their hopes, dreams, and feelings after somebody then got popped in the eye, right? Like I have a very old school experience with her. I mean, the thing that I was expressing to her, to which she laughed at me first, and then, you know, try to address it more kind of like casually to tell me what restorative justice is. I don't think people know what restorative justice is. We talk about it, we say the term, but if you're not initiated or you haven't taught or learned, I mean, where are we wrong when we think it's kind of a lax way of really not dealing with discipline issues?
So I think that restorative justice has gotten that bad rap because people see it as a program, and it's not a program, it's a philosophy, it's a way of being. It's actually, you know, it's been brought back and kind of been, it's more Eurocentric now, but many indigenous cultures, so in African cultures, it's called Ubuntu, right? Where you see there's a picture of Africans sitting around in a circle, and it's a way that they handle harms that come up in the community instead of it all having sort of a punishment motive or like you're bad, you know, we shouldn't. And so that's why I support it, is because just the philosophy of it is like trying to reinforce good behavior. Discipline literally means teaching, right? It doesn't mean punishment. And I think people have gotten that people literally think discipline is synonymous with punishment. And for kids, especially for kids, I always have problems with why are people against this for kids. There's literally brain researches show that they're growing, like their brains aren't fully formed, like all of these different things. Of course they're gonna make mistakes. We're supposed to allow room for mistakes for kids. And restorative justice is a way for them to learn, right, socially unacceptable behaviors. They're not learning every time you know, oh, okay, you're gone for 3 days. And then you're not getting any access to education while you're sitting at home for 3 days. Your parents have to work. You may not even be getting a meal, you know, so all of these things have to be taken into consideration. So one of the things that happened that ironically I found out was actually happening in Dayton when we started our campaign is that there actually was a school in Dayton doing robust restorative justice, but it happened to be on the east side of Dayton. And so Dayton is segregated. East side is predominantly white and immigrant. And when I say immigrant, immigrants from like Eastern European countries and other places. And West Dayton is predominantly African American. Literally the schools that my son attended his entire life in Dayton were about 97% Black. They're literally all Black schools. But the school in West Dayton is called Ruskin. They were already doing it. I remember we went to visit. They had educators, you know, who loved the program, who was a major proponent of it. She was leading it, and they were doing it for kids who were doing all kinds of things. So a lot of these kids were at the time, because the opioid epidemic was really bad in Dayton. It was on the national news for one of the places that the epidemic was really one of the worst in the country. And so a lot of those kids live in East Dayton, if you will. And so they were dealing with kids who were coming from homes that, you know, their parents weren't able to take care of them well, and they had a lot of behavioral issues, right? So instead of them pathologizing and kicking those kids out, they literally started a restorative justice way of dealing with things for those kids, because some of those kids were seeing their parents as, you know, some of them had overdosed, or they would see them, you know, some of them had passed away. So it was a lot of different things that was happening that would obviously cause some behavior issues with kids in school. So instead of them doing the punitive approach, they decided to do restorative justice, and it literally worked. It literally worked for those kids. And school, as we hear as a cliche all the time, was a refuge for them in many ways. And what we did, we went down to the school board and said, and then we confronted the teachers union, like, so y'all against restorative justice for Black kids, but ain't got no problem with the restorative justice going over here in East Dayton. And that's when
on that note, I don't think that they've negotiated that well with the community. Like, because I think, teachers and educators privately, and I know this as somebody who has been in the rooms on these conversations, have a series of things that they are concerned about that they feel like is the truth that they can't tell.
Yeah.
And that you don't teach, so you don't know, right? I'll give you
Right.
one example. I was at the Congressional Black Caucus meeting. This is probably about 4 or 5 years ago. The NEA held a panel. I think it was moderated by David Johns, and it was an NEA panel. And on that panel was a principal who said, every year I make an example suspension at the beginning of the year. I suspend somebody for people to see it, or expel somebody. I can't remember if it was expel or suspend somebody to let other people know I'm not playing, and I mean business. And I gasped, and I said, I didn't, Zakiya, I honestly did not know this was coming out of my mouth, but I just kind of quipped like, "Oh, hell no." Right? It just came out like that real fast. In the seating line that I was in, it was all teachers in the room. They swung
Yeah.
their heads toward me, and one of them said, "Do you teach?"
Wow.
And that's exactly what my response was like, "Wow, no, I just have children. I don't, no, I don't teach." But I think what she just said is whack. But and this is all Black people. This is a room full of
I
Black
know.
people. There's no
Yeah.
white people in this room, so this isn't a white
Right.
problem in this situation. But they literally, their response was, "You don't teach, so you don't know what the real thing is. You don't know what the
Mhm.
real deal is." I think there's a lot of that in silence. We don't negotiate that as a community with them, back and forth, where we get to hear each other. So they have, for community PR purposes, they have to say they're for restorative justice, but behind the scenes they are
They
not.
didn't in Dayton. Oh, they
Yeah.
would come to our meetings. Some of the, I mean, white and Black teachers, not all of them, but they would come to our meetings and say, "No, these kids," they would say horrible things. And we're talking about preschoolers, we're talking about first graders, kindergartners. They would say horrible things. This child sexually assaulted me. A 6-year-old can't even legally sexually assault a teen. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So
Wow.
I looked at Professor Randall, who's my co-founder. Love her, Professor Vernelia Randall. I have to give her a shout out. She was a community activist, but she's a community activist who did not stay in the ivory towers. Here she was, a law professor at the University of Dayton School of Law. And I remember she and I would just look at each other like, this problem is worse than what we thought.
Mm-hmm. And it was
With
an
how our
attitude problem, right?
Yes, it was the
Yeah.
attitude.
Mm-hmm.
because and then every time I would bring up Ruskin to them, I was like, "But did y'all go over there and protest the program at Ruskin?"
Mm-hmm.
And what, come to find out, Ruskin did it on their own and didn't necessarily broadcast it or even get permission. You had the building leadership was for it. It was like, we have to love on these kids. We have to take care of them. Their parents are strung out, on opioids, and so we can't throw them away. And so what I was saying is, like, we need to have the same attitude for the kids in West Dayton,
Mm-hmm.
whatever's going on, because what we hear is, well, I can't care about them if their parents don't care. And we would hear that all the time. The parents don't care about their kids in West Dayton, which couldn't be further from the truth. We hear all of these pathologizing narratives. Black people don't care about education. That's historically inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, people have lost their lives, Black people, to trying to learn how to read, for building schools. We've taken the little pennies that we were making sharecropping and building entire education institutions to teach our people. So I resent that kind of narrative. And I have done a lot of work on narrative change just within the community,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also externally is doing narrative change around this pathologization of particularly poor and working class Black parents.
Mm-hmm.
No one sees what they really go through. We were on the front page of Dayton Daily News, and one of the parents, one of our core parent leaders, told her story. Shout out to Jeremy Kelly, as an education reporter for Dayton Daily News, always covered us fairly. But he literally told her story of her losing her waitress job because her sons constantly being suspended and expelled from a Dayton City school.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what kind of turned the tide for us, was also having a partnership with the media. And the media is very powerful. And thankfully, he always covered us very fairly.
Yeah, I did notice when I used to work in government assistance systems at one of the core reasons, one of the clear reasons that the people that I worked with lost jobs was that they were being called down to schools every third day. Every third or fourth day, everything was a problem. I had to go on visits with them to some of those schools to try and work it out so that we could keep a mother working, right?
Exactly.
And y'all got to do your job. You have the child for the day. What can we do? And it was very hard to work with schools on something like that. It was very hard. And you know what? A family's economic security was on the line in that situation.
Exactly. But a lot of them didn't see that, or they didn't care. One of the things that I like that when we finally got the restorative justice programs of philosophy going in Dayton City schools is that it didn't even cost a lot of money. There was simply restructuring. Like there was a dedicated classroom that literally had mindfulness stations set up. It had like a little bean bag if a child was really having an outburst. No one is saying that a child who's losing it has to stay in the classroom. Like people were trying to paint us as being unreasonable. All we were saying is don't kick them out of a school where they miss their 2 meals a day, right? All of Dayton is poor. Dayton is a landlocked city. So Ohio is one of those places where, every little community has a school system, right? Because people want to hold on to their own tax dollars and want to have, homogeneity, so most of the suburbs are lily white. And so Dayton is landlocked by all of these suburbs and it's poor. The schools are funded, how we fund schools in this country. It's funded by property taxes. And so once the General Motors plant closed up and went to Mexico or wherever it was after NAFTA, that literally gutted the city of Dayton's and the school district's budget because those middle class jobs were gone and they were replaced with working class jobs.
Wait a second, Zakiya. Wait a second now.
Oh,
I thought charter schools are the reason that the schools got defunded. Now you telling me it's GM? Wow.
In Dayton,
the jobs.
It was jobs. It was the plant closed, and that it also hurt other smaller communities too. Jefferson Township, which is a little township, they have their own school district. Trotwood is a African American suburb of Dayton. It was one of the first suburbs that kind of integrated. So you know how that is. Once integration starts happening, white people pick up and move on somewhere else. So, it's complicated. Everything is not always black and white. It's extremely complicated. And I can only tell you from that experience is that race and class is very much an issue in Dayton and other places. I live here in Montgomery County, Maryland now. And I have to say from my experience, because the district it's a county-wide district. So Silver Spring is in there. Your kids go to school with the housewives of what is it? Chesapeake. What is it? That's it. Whatever the Potomac. So that's my county, right? So my kids go to the same school. These rich people's kids, the school system, they go to the same school system. So the pot of money helps everybody. I'm a working / middle class woman now, and so. But my school district has like the housewives of the Potomac kids in it too. So like there's not this landlocked. So the issue here is not money. It's still a belief gap though, right? It's still about where the resources are going. So there's still small fights that we have to pick around even gifted and talented programs, here, making sure that Black children have access to that. So the problems are different, but seeing Black people through a deficit lens is still an issue, even in a wealthy county.
So I'm going to just, this is a place for me just to be honest and to open up with things as much as I spent time looking at these issues. I'm 20 years in now and working either in government systems, helping families with economic security issues or housing or jobs. And education became a part of that at some point. There are still things in all this time that I have tried to self-educate myself where I don't 100% have my mind around certain parts of it. This discipline one is one of them because I have seen enough research that tells me about the biases within the institution and the people that we hire to work with our kids. Okay, let's just put that to rest. I've seen enough of that. I still have a middle classness about me now, and I earned my middle classness too. So anybody and whatnot. I earned my middle classness. It is not something I
Me
listen.
too.
If you call me middle class right now, I feel like I did something in life because it did not start out that way for me. So I feel like I earned it,
Amen.
right? But it came with some things that where like, you know, I have to fight my own demons now to not be Bill
Yeah.
Cosby on certain things, right? So
Yeah.
so I don't know if you ever watch World Star Hip Hop or if you ever watch like,
I hate it. I
yeah,
never watched it. I
yeah.
mean,
So
I think clips on social media.
I watch a lot of World Star Hip Hop, but at least
Oh
I
my
have.
God.
And then, you know, on YouTube, there are these entire genres on YouTube of fighting, you know, like fight videos, right? Of people fighting, like hood fights. And, you know, I'm sorry to
Oh my
say I
God.
have watched a little bit of it or not,
Oh
but
my
you see
goodness.
these things in classrooms. You know, people are taking video now in classrooms of kids just clowning teachers, right? Black, white, or
I know.
otherwise,
Yeah.
picking up chairs. Now, I visited schools where, like, I had a friend who taught, and I hope she's not watching this. I haven't talked to her in a long time, but I visited her classroom after thinking she was a great teacher for a long time, and kids were jumping off the desks in her classroom, right? And I was like tripping. I was like, you know, I never knew that you had a wild classroom right next door. There was a teacher that wasn't having that. Like that was not
Exactly.
going on in that classroom.
Classroom management. Yeah.
Yeah. But my middle classness, where I was going with that is when I see a video of a teacher getting clowned and somebody picking up a desk or a chair and throwing it at them, which I have literally seen these videos and I can show them to you. And then teachers complain about that sort of thing, but they feel like they have to do it in hushed tones, right? Or else they fear being called racist or whatnot. I don't know how to call that one because, like, I believe in that racism is in the system. I believe there's institutional racism and bias and blah blah. And at the same time, I don't know what you do when you have a kid that's throwing a desk at you.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, I don't even think that's a middle class issue. I mean, I was raised in the South and I was raised by great grandparents who lived through the, Great Depression and all of that. So I was raised up pretty conservatively. I'm sharing all of that for context. And so that's called nonsense and would not be tolerated in my Black household and wouldn't be tolerated in mine.
Right.
What we're talking about, and I think is advocates who are pushing for justice in education around equity issues. We're not advocating and saying that it's okay for children to misbehave and even pick up desks and potentially hurt another student or hurt a teacher. Nobody is advocating for that. But we are saying is that we also don't want to lock that child up for life either, right?
Mm-hmm.
We want that child to get some discipline. We want that child to learn from his behavior. If that child has some kind of mental health issue going on, we want that to be evaluated. Like, we're just saying that we want, instead of us being so quick to throw kids away, this is me. Instead of us being so quick to throw kids away, let's be quick to deal with that kind of situation and help them get through it. One of the things that I always point to is Malcolm X. He was once known as Detroit Red. He was robbing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And look who, now he's one of our greatest leaders that we all lean on and think about and we all quote to this day. So what I'm saying is that every child can be a potential Malcolm X or a potential whoever. There's another young brother that I just learned about. His name is Dr. Mabry. He's a doctor now. He's from Mississippi, but he shows this picture of himself with all these tattoos, got gold teeth in his mouth. He was constantly expelled and suspended in middle school and high school. And now he's a motivational speaker to educators about not giving up on kids, about, not that he's an exception or is an exceptionalism, but just showing that, hey, somebody loved me enough to give me time to correct my behavior and become who I am today. And so that's all I'm saying. Grace.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Grace. Yeah, we don't get grace often, especially Black boys. It's assumed that we're already aggressive, criminal, a problem, bad, needing to be controlled. You just keep going down the list. So when something bad happens, your first instinct is to not treat it like an innocent white child who's just having a bad moment. It's to say, no, this is you again needing to be corrected. Now, a few people so Michelle Johnson, Deborah Watkins have said, why is the child picking up the desk in the first place? Right? Does anybody ask that question? Erica Strauss says that clearly the kids have no connection to the classroom, connection to the teachers, or feelings of being valued, etc. So I think people are. Here's the thing about some of the folks that watch this though. or listen to this. Some of the people that watch this or making these comments are professionals. Like they know what they're talking about. They have background. They have research. They've learned. They're
Yeah,
learned people.
Deborah and Erica are educators.
Yeah, they're educators
Erica
and
is
learned
actually a
people.
current educator in Howard County schools here in Maryland.
But people who are like me, I consider myself reasonably intelligent, but I'm self-taught. Like everything I know, I had to like learn, just kind of learn, like
Me
read and
too.
learn and whatnot. Yeah,
We're about the
YouTube.
same. Yep.
Yeah, we're on the same on that way. And then when we work as advocates with community members, we figure out that like we're trying to teach kids, but we don't teach our community. Like we don't unpack this for our community, like what restorative justice actually means and what it actually looks
We
like.
did at Racial Justice Now. We would have monthly parent meetings, and we would always have a topic. That's why local organizing matters. Is because that's exactly what we did. We did political education with community members, like to just go through like the history of education, because what we wanted to do was this internalized thing. Because even working class parents who were victims will say, well, I just got to do better. And I'm like, well, you do it. And I would have to encourage them. I'm like, you do realize you work third shift, right? When are you supposed to get some rest? It's okay, right? You're doing the best that you can. And that's why you have community. That's why you have me. That's why you have others who can stand in the gap when you're not able to be there. We used to do that. And I say we as in African Americans, we used to do that so well. And I don't know sort of what happened, in between there, but that's something that we tried to rekindle at Racial Justice Now in Dayton, was having that communal kind of camaraderie where if one parent wasn't able to be there, then other parents would kind of step in the gap, or other community members would surround them with support, like literally a support system. You'd be surprised at how many families did not have a support system. For me, I was privileged in that way. Even though I was working class, I was also living in a house that my great aunt and uncle owned, so I didn't have to pay rent. Other people had obligations to pay rent. I was able to be the strong advocate and stand in the gap because my family's middle class status, or upper middle class status, because they were the African Americans who enjoyed that generation of affirmative action and other programs that made sure Black people had those high income jobs in Ohio. So yeah, I use that to pay it forward.
I think this is a big point that you just made about advocacy and activism that's hitting me right now as I think about it, on the point that I just made about so many of these folks in the comments are learned people and educated people who don't necessarily drink the Kool-Aid, though, of their colleagues. So in my years of activism, I've been in a lot of community meetings, and we have had visits from civil rights attorneys and from professors and from unions. Wanting to help us form our agendas and whatnot. What we didn't have are Black educators who knew something about, like our commenters here do, that could have informed us and made us better advocates about what really goes down in schools. Right. When we'd have the unions in those meetings, we would probably leave more confused than we were leaving well equipped, with what really goes down. I still don't know what you do about the kid throwing the desk. What I've seen in this timeline here is people saying, well, you have to figure out why he threw the desk in the first place.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's another thing that I always encourage parents, because that's classic what educators will do. To this day, if I get a call about my son or even my daughter now who's in kindergarten, if someone is calling me and saying, oh, this behavior happened, my first question is, oh, okay, what happened before that? What triggered it? They never tell you, to me, context. I always ask parents, ask for context, because you will internalize, well, they just bad. Because I hear parents say, well, no, he's bad. Really? I mean, it'd be little kids, because they just internalize that. But I mean, as far as throwing a desk, I do think we need to ask that question, why did he throw the desk and what happened? What triggered that? I know that that's extreme and somebody can get hurt. But again, I'm also not signing up for throwing that kid away either.
No, and I know as we wrap, this is what I'll say about this last piece. This is a conversation that we really need to keep having, unpacking and educating each other as we go forward, because it's not something that is easily understood, not in my mind. And, right. I feel like I'm reasonably intelligent trying to understand and don't always get it. And the more I see professionals argue about it, the more confused I get. Like to see researchers and teachers argue about it, I get more upset. But I appreciate your activism and your leadership on these issues, because it
Yes.
is not easily pigeonholed, right? You're not a stereotype. You're not like just sucking down anybody's party line. You're not just going with one
Mhm.
agenda. And I honestly feel that's the only way we can win, is to not be beholden to any one agenda. Like, we
That's
need to
right.
to adapt, be able to
That's
adapt
right.
and move as a team, though. Um,
That's right.
More than anything. Listen, I have been throughout the show. Your Twitter handle has been going down across the bottom. I want my viewers and listeners to know that you should look for Zakiya. If you don't follow her now on Twitter, you should follow her. You should get in touch with her if she has said anything that has piqued your interest, and we can provide
Yeah.
more information about. Um, what I want to do is I want to give away 3 copies of the book that you mentioned. So if you are watching this and you are seeing this and you want a free book that gives you a basis and a background for everything that we have talked about today, for most of what we talked about today, email me at Christopher@activist.com. That's Christopher@activist.com. I will ship 3 books out to the first 3 people that get in touch with me and ask me for it. Zakiya, thank you for coming on this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be working with you and in partnership with you on the Bright Beam team. And want all of your viewers and listeners to look for great things coming out from Bright Beam.
We're going to do it.
Yes.
We're going to do it, and we're going to win.
All right.